Worshipping Power is a book about where states came from, how they evolved, and why. And I wrote it on the basis of a number of years of research that I decided to undertake for my own reasons. I'm not an academic, I'm not an expert. I did rely a lot on resources coming from academia, coming from experts. But on the one hand, I decided to take on this project because of my participation in social movements in the streets, coming up against state power like any of us do, whether we're anarchists or whether we're another kind of anti-capitalist, or whether we're just trying to stop a garbage incinerator from getting built in our neighborhood or anything like that. Any kind of struggle like that will inevitably bring you up into contact with, in conflict really with state power. And so the idea was that it could make our struggles more effective to have a better idea of where states came from, how they evolved, and so forth. Like I mentioned, I did rely on a lot of academics, of professionals, and what they're publishing about state formation. But that's an important question that we have to ask. Why would people get paid to study state formation? And there are some notable and for me admirable exceptions. Some folks who within the academy study state formation from a liberatory perspective, from the perspective of people on bottom who were negatively affected by that process. But that's not where the money is. That's just a few cases. So aside from a couple tenure track positions for folks studying that, the money for learning about state formation is in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Somalia, where state power has collapsed and where dominant states like the US are paying professionals to prop up state power or to reestablish a new state more thoroughly under their control. So no knowledge is neutral. Knowledge is always framed, is always organized in certain ways that affects how it can be deployed and even how we might understand it. So the vast majority of knowledge of studies about state formation still privilege the state as the default protagonist of history and as a necessary framework within which societies have to exist. In public school, they teach us certain things about where states come from that at this point in time just can't be justified anymore. So a lot of the old stories about how states were inevitable, or states, like the Hobbesian view that states were good, they were needed to save us from a state of savagery and a state of brutality, and even ideas that cling on a little bit more tenaciously, like that states were necessary once societies grew to build and organize large, spread out infrastructures. None of those arguments can really be sustained anymore. In every case, we have examples of societies, also very large societies with high population densities or with very, very complex, spread out infrastructural works that were stateless, that were horizontal, oftentimes that worked better than state-organized infrastructure. So there's a lot of, for example, Vandana Shiva in India, others in Africa have documented examples of decentralized, horizontally organized infrastructure works for irrigation that worked much better than what, in both cases of East Africa and India, what the British Empire imposed, their scientific, supposedly superior irrigation works, but that weren't designed to help people meet their needs, because that's not what states do. They were designed to enforce, to impose monocrop cultivation for export, for the enrichment of the empire, and in times of drought those failed spectacularly, and folks there reverted to their autochthonous, to their own developed forms of irrigation works, which were actually designed to help people survive droughts and things like that. And at this point, it's generally accepted among experts that state formation universally provokes resistance, that in general people don't like to live under states if they have a choice, and that state formation usually lowers people's quality of living, lowers indicators relating to health and so forth, and also that state formation historically is very tied up with slavery or some form of obligatory labor. So there's, on the left, there's a lot of other theories about state formation, where states come from. These tend to share a few elements that I find not helpful. They tend to choose one lens, one optic for looking at state formation, but propose it as the cause of state formation or the only way to analyze state formation. And any of those optics can generally be very helpful for certain looking at cases of state formation, but there are other stories of state formation that are not well explained by those, so we can get into some of those later on in the talk. And also, they tend to view state formation as a sort of Pandora's box, as a process that once it starts, inevitably spreads across the globe, and therefore also implicitly as a superior model. So even if nowadays anybody making a serious argument has to acknowledge that states are coercive, they're brutal, they're exploitative, they're oppressive, if they can still frame the question as something that just happened inevitably and now it just happens to cover all of the world, so we just have to work within that framework, we don't really have an alternative, then they've effectively bypassed any kind of ethical argument or any kind of debate about quality of life, about freedom, about how we actually want to organize our societies and our lives. So I very intentionally arranged this book in a non-chronological way. So if you're reading it and it seems like it's going all over the place, it's because it is going all over the place because I wanted it to break with what in the end tends to be a very Eurocentric, progressivist view of history, that history is unilineal, that it follows a single path from less to more complex and from worse to better, which is one of the fundamental elements of Western and also white supremacist mythology, that history moves in this way. For one thing, there are many more states in the world that have collapsed or that have been overthrown by their own subjects than states that have successfully projected their power over time. So just because right now the whole world is dominated by this modern state model developed in Western Europe doesn't mean that that's the end of history, doesn't mean that that's like the natural trajectory of history. And from a different perspective, maybe 200 years from now, that might just appear like a very tragic and bloody blip on the trajectory, or trajectories, really, of human history. So the book isn't chronologically arranged to break with this idea of of progress. To break with the idea that it started at one point in Mesopotamia and from there just inevitably spread over the entire world. Also, the book is organized that way in order to look at multiple pathways of state formation. So there are patterns that I think can be traced between different cases of state formation, but really each case is unique, and there may be different patterns or sort of different categories that histories of state formation can be grouped into. So that's also an idea that I think has become a lot more accepted in the academy among experts in state formation, that there are multiple pathways to state formation, but still when that history is being told in a way that privileges the state as either the framework or the protagonist for human societies or for history, then we really lose some of the radical ramifications of that idea, that societies can change and can evolve in practically unlimited ways, and so they also don't have to develop into states, or they can overthrow states and organize themselves in a very different way. So I very intentionally was not looking for like the one theoretical factor, the one cause of state formation that would explain state formation in societies on continents all across the world. And actually, what I found seems to uphold that idea, that there are many different possible factors, but I did find one element that seemed to be present in every single case of state formation, and also every case where a non-state society was conquered by a statist society and then forced in some way through some process of colonialism to adopt a state structure. And that element is patriarchal social organization. It seems that every society that's developed a state, like I said, or that had a state imposed on it, in the first case, either had some forms of patriarchal power structures and hierarchies already in place and already normalized and accepted within their society, or in the second case, with the case of colonization, if they were a non-patriarchal society, it seemed that one of the very important activities carried out by the colonizers was to encourage patriarchal dynamics and values in that colonized society. And so that really, to me, communicates a lot about the dangers of partial revolutions. The dangers of, because like I mentioned, many states throughout history have been overthrown. And in a Eurocentric history, those are typically not described as revolutions. They're described as like collapses or some mysterious process. But many states have been overthrown, but in a revolution that overthrows this brutal exploitative power structure, but doesn't identify similar or underlying power structures that made that one possible, those societies are much more likely in a relatively short amount of time to redevelop a new state structure and a new system of oppressive authority. So that's basically the shtick on the theoretical model that I'm using. I don't want to bore you all by going into that in a lot more detail. If anyone wants to know like the definitions that I was using to define what constitutes a state, what doesn't, then like after this first part of the talk and like the more like question and debate part, please ask and we can go to that. But otherwise, it's fairly technical, and I'm not sure if y'all's interest is more technical or more theoretical or more how all of these things relate to our movements and our struggles today. So there are a lot of different axes along which we can follow state formation, way more than we have time to go into today. So I wanted to name a few possibilities and just ask what y'all want to go into to see what's more interesting for you. I will say that one of them I'm going to go into anyways because I think it's I think it's easiest when looking at that one to see how the study of state formation is relevant to our struggles today. And that's looking at the democratic model of the state. So that I think it becomes pretty obvious how that could be relevant to us today. So the other ones, and we'll have time for maybe one, maybe two of them. So I'll just throw them out there and see what's most interesting for y'all. Would be warfare as a motive for state formation. Among archaeologists, that's a very common theory that warfare causes state formation. There's a lot of validity to that because warfare creates opportunities for elites to increase their power, to develop new organizational models, to develop bureaucracies and so forth. But there are also plenty of cases where that really doesn't work as an explanation, as a cause, because of so many cases of horizontal, more anti-authoritarian societies that engaged in defensive warfare against colonizers, against neighboring states that tried to conquer them, and didn't become more authoritarian, but in fact, if anything, became more anti-authoritarian, and identified more with their own anti-authoritarian communal self-organizing characteristics in opposition to this either a colonizer or this aggressive conquest-oriented neighbor. So that's one possibility, to look at warfare, how it does and how it doesn't lead to state formation. Another one would be kinship, to look at how different models of family, of how we are or are not related, can allow states to form or can prevent states from forming. So warfare and kinship. Economic accumulation or commerce. So typical materialist theories about state formation, privilege, the sphere of economic accumulation to explain state formation. And that's, I think, a very useful optic, especially with the formation of the modern state in Western Europe towards the end of like medieval Europe and going on into the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. but it also leaves a lot out, and there are also many histories of state formation that can't be explained by that model. So, okay, warfare, kinship, economic accumulation, spiritual accumulation. How a site of spiritual production, and I would define what that is if we go into that, can change a society's spiritual values in such a way that authority and that eventually oppression and exploitation can be sold as sacred, can be sold not only normalized, but passed off as these really valuable things, and also necessary for being spiritually human, in the way that when you have a society in which spirituality isn't created in a diffuse way, it isn't created by all of us together, but it's created by a specialized elite, by like a priest class, how they can create a spiritual system in which, in order to be fully human, in order to participate fully in your community, you actually have to reproduce these values of obedience, of worshiping power. And that's particularly useful to states that don't yet have the coercive ability to force people to obey. And then the last one, since I'm going to talk about democracy anyway, would be ecological crises. As far as I can tell, it seems that states inevitably destroy their environments. They inevitably destroy nature. And many states that have collapsed because of ecological crises they've triggered. In the past, that's been on a regional scale and not on a global scale like we're seeing now. But there are also many stories of states that actually take advantage of ecological crises that they provoke in order to increase their power. And that's something that we would definitely see in the world around us. We can already see early signs of this as states try to, at the moment very incompetently, try to deal with climate change, but also deal with climate change in a largely military way, and also as an opportunity to exploit in order to increase or improve techniques of social control. So really quick again, that would be warfare, kinship, economic accumulation, spiritual production, and ecological crises. So feel free to just raise your hand or shout out, just to get a sense of maybe if there's one or two of those that are particularly interesting.
Spiritual production.
Spiritual production?
Ecological.
Ecological?
Warfare.
Warfare? Alright, we may have to... we got two on ecological. I won't make y'all vote, but we did play rock, paper, scissors to see which options we go into in Columbus. So let's see. So ecological has been repeated, and then warfare and spiritual production have been.
I'll defer.
You'll defer.
No,
Okay.
warfare is good too, yeah. I'm happy with any of them.
Any tiebreakers out there?
I'm going to go with spiritual as well. But
Okay.
that doesn't really help.
Well, no, because then we'd have two each for spiritual and ecological.
Yeah.
Were you gonna?
Ecological.
Ecological. Okay, spiritual and ecological. All right. Great.
So the bottom one's
So-
Pretty quiet.
All right. So I just realized that I left my notebook in the last, in the place that I just came from today. So that means that this version of the talk is going to be very easy listening. Like there won't be any dates or a lot of specific figures or anything like that. So I'll just talk more about general trends. So let's see. Let's start off talking about spiritual production. One of the stories that illustrates that really clearly is, as far as we know, the first story of state formation in Sumer in Mesopotamia, going back 6,000 years, so 4,000 BCE. So basically, agriculture was invented. I mean, it's like, it wasn't like a single moment, it was a process, but we can say roughly 12,000 years ago in the area that's now Turkey, Syria, Iraq. And then, so there's a lot of a lot of people say that the invention of agriculture leads to state formation, but really you had about 6,000 years go by between the invention of agriculture and the formation of the first state there. And in human terms, that's a very long time. That's many, many dozens of human generations without developing the state. And most of that time seems to have been relatively smooth. In that people lived in, those who practiced agriculture lived in small settlements, and they sowed fields in the area immediately around them. Still within that regional system, on the peripheries of that system, there were still people who were hunting and gathering, who were probably in contact with the folks who had started planting. And it makes a lot of sense that they were living in small settlements because cities, from an agricultural perspective, are very inefficient. And that's actually one of the first indications we have that strictly economic explanations for state formation fall short, because at many points throughout the history of state formation, we see states doing things that are actually economically inefficient, but necessary for considerations of social control. And cities were one of those. When your society is based on agricultural production, it doesn't make sense to get a whole lot of people together. I mean, it's a public health nightmare. Also, you have to go a lot farther afield in order to work the fields that are necessary to feed all those people that you have concentrated there. Now, what's really interesting about the first city, Uruk, which appeared around 4000 BCE, so around 6,000 years ago, is that it seems that the city was built simultaneous to, or even after, the building of the temple that it was based around. And this first temple was basically a raised platform. It was a very large, what came to be known as the ziggurat, so it was a very large mound that was level on top. So it was basically a raised stage. But on top of that, it was a stage covered in a reflective stone, a stone that reflected sunlight. So basically you have a relatively flat area. Hundreds or thousands of years ago, all of the old growth forest would have been cut down. So there's no natural competition in terms of something that's awe-inspiring, right? And then all of a sudden, in the space of a certain number of years, you have this huge structure built that's bigger than anything you've ever seen before, right? Because all of the old growth forest and the region had long since been cut down. You can see it from the horizon, and it glows, it shines when the sun hits it. And other people like you had built that, right? So this is what we can consider a site of spiritual production. It's something that has the capability for producing new power relations and producing new spiritual values, and acting as a sort of center of social gravity, of bringing people together when you have no police force. One thing that a lot of early states did was they actually would go, and instead of conquering territory, they would conquer peoples. They would basically kidnap entire communities and bring them back and put them to work and force them to work. That was a pretty universal activity among early states, but that required them to have some kind of military. And at this point, there's no military, there's no coercive apparatus, no police force, nothing that anyone can do to force someone to work. One thing I did mention, in at least some of these societies living here in these small settlements, they did have, at the very least, light forms of patriarchal organization, in which it seems that the eldest male of the highest status lineage in each community seemed to be the person who was sort of the intermediary with the spirits, potentially ancestor spirits or local deities. But there were some light forms of inequality that had been normalized and legitimized. But those people didn't have, those priests or ensi didn't have the ability to force anybody to work, to kill anybody, to severely punish people. They had to work more charismatically, convincing their community rather than forcing people to do things. But so when you have this this temple, you have this gravitational force, you could say, that pulls people together. So that was fundamental to the construction of the first city. And once you have a larger concentration of people participating in this spiritual experience, participating in this performance, right? Because we have this raised platform, so what we're dealing with are spiritual performances and spectators that are coming together to participate in this, albeit passively. Then you also have a larger number of spiritual performers, of priests, of spiritual specialists, together in one place, coordinating and creating new organizational opportunities, creating new opportunities to create structures that in these really small, diffuse, dispersed settlements, they could never have created. And hand in hand with having the possibility of creating these new structures, they have a much larger audience than they ever had before, and so they have the possibility to work on their society's spiritual values in a way that they didn't have before. And one quick tangent that I want to throw in there. Well, I'm talking about spiritual production, but I very much don't want to give the impression that I'm talking about superstitious as opposed to reasonable societies or anything like that. I think every society has its mythologies, every society has spiritual values, and some of these values promote communal, horizontal, and ecocentric living. Other sets of values promote the worship of authority figures, and others, like in our society, promote the idea that we have no spiritual ideas, we have no mythologies, that everything that we believe just so happens to be a cold, hard fact, and there's no question of cultural framing or anything like that. But then it also happens to teach us that the earth exists for our benefit, that any invention that can be invented should be invented, and that there's yeah, I mean, it definitely places a culturally specific, if not to say Eurocentric and white supremacist vision of humanity and what constitutes humanity at the center of the universe, even if we no longer think that the earth is geometrically the center of the universe. So, right, so you have this site of spiritual production. Like I said, I don't have my notes with me, so I'm going to be very approximate from here on out. In the next few hundred years, you see a sort of acceleration of social changes. There are, over the next, we say very roughly 500 years, I think it might have been 600, there's evidence that new temples were built and destroyed, or sorry, new shrines at the top of this platform, the top of this pyramid, were built and destroyed. So that suggests that there was some kind of warfare between different spiritual systems, maybe different deities, maybe also different sects or different groups of specialized priests. The content was changing, but not the underlying mechanism, right? Because there doesn't seem to be evidence that anyone tried to demolish this platform, which creates this mass of spectators, which creates this first city, but simply that you had maybe the followers of different gods or different spiritual practices, different rituals, fighting against one another, demolishing one shrine and building another right on top of it. And that suggests that, well, they were fighting over something. Right? And so it suggests the possibility that they were making increasingly absolute claims to truth if it was worthwhile to destroy one person's shrine and put your own on top of it. And then after about 500, I think 600 years, you get the first closed temples on top of this structure. That is very, very significant because it means that you're limiting who can participate in these spiritual rituals. You now have a closed structure that not everyone in this growing city can fit into, which means that probably the majority of the population there is now excluded from full participation in their society's spiritual life. But it also means that the value of that spiritual production is growing because now it's secretive. Now there's a secretive aspect to it. So we can infer that these priest classes, these specialized priest classes, now had insider's knowledge. It was now a professional caste that controlled knowledge and that could exclude parts of that knowledge, or rather prevent the rest of their society from gaining access to the full body of that knowledge. And it also meant that the force of gravity that they had created, the spiritual integration that they had put into play was so strong now that people could be excluded and they wouldn't just go home. That was now permanently their home. Right? Because at the beginning I talked about how this had to be a voluntary process. They had to create something that drew people there. So now they were secure enough that people were cemented in place that even if they started partially excluding them, which goes hand in hand with creating a more hierarchical society, something closer to a caste system, they wouldn't want to, or they wouldn't be able to just go home. And then it's a few hundred years after that that we have the first archaeological evidence of organized warfare, of armies, of defensive fortifications around this first city-state, Uruk, and the other city-states that subsequently had sprung up in the region, and that were now engaging in warfare one against the other for another period of a few hundred years until political unification was achieved throughout this entire regional system. So that's, I think, really interesting, being able to break down that timeline and see how important this site of spiritual production was in order to create all of the other things that we more commonly associate with the state. Militaries, ruling class, the ability to force people to work, taxation, bureaucracies, and so forth. And of course, the priests were also the first bureaucrats, because written language was developed simultaneously for religious rituals and stories, and also for taxation, for keeping track of economic production and so forth. And the people in the beginning who were carrying out these rituals were also the people who were carrying out, who were the scribes, who were the bureaucrats, who were carrying out taxation and all the rest. And then that the importance of that spiritual power was definitely recognized when eventually, when Sumer was politically unified, the supreme ruler was considered divine, was considered a deity. So that was a centralization of spiritual power in a region where previously most likely spiritual power was very diffuse, and at least within reach of everyone in the community, even if there were light hierarchies within each community. In the case of the Inca state in the Andes, it's also very interesting. They developed their state sort of as a combination in some ways of Quechua and Aymara populations, which inhabited very different geographical, ecological terrains. So that's not so common, having a state develop bridging to basically the Andean highlands and then like Las Yungas, sort of jungle valleys, where very different types of economic production can take place. And so networks, which were basically combinations of trade and spiritual networks. In fact, it seems that those categories, in fact, would be inappropriate, that those would be one and the same within that society. The movement of goods and the movement of spiritual ideas seem to be very connected. One of the ways that the Inca states integrated other societies was basically by including their god into the Inca pantheon, subordinate to their gods, but basically, instead of just obliterating their beliefs, including them within their network. But also this network, it was used to move a lot of goods across a huge area and between very different bioregions. And the interesting thing is, this gets more into ideas of economic accumulation, but before the idea of currency, of monetary exchange could even make sense, because if you sit down and think about it, that's really an insane idea. Like everything that you can see around you is worth a certain number, and that's really important, and we're going to spend our whole lives trying to accumulate more of these abstract numbers. That's a pretty insane idea to convince people of. A lot of the things that were being moved throughout this network, which was largely controlled again by specialized priests, were items of spiritual value, items that we would say have no utilitarian value. So for example, tropical bird feathers that were used in very important rituals. But that actually is a much more convincing process by which to give something value than the idea that we've practically naturalized of monetary exchange or monetary accumulation, right? We need this item for this ritual, which is very important for us to renew our relations with the natural world, to make sure that we are healthy, to bind ourselves together as a community. So those networks can potentially give items, imbue items with an abstract value, which can eventually pave the way for other less charismatic, less binding forms of abstract value. Let's see, how long are we speaking? Right. The other one was ecological crisis, right? Okay. So, let's see. Alright. Trying to, because I don't know the words, there were a few details. So Polynesian societies spread across the Pacific, settled hundreds of different islands, large and small. There are more deterministic theorists who use them as an example to basically support the idea of environmental or geographic determinism, because basically the Polynesians created states on islands that were larger than a certain size limit, and they didn't create states on islands that were smaller than that. So that can be an argument to say, if you have a large enough land base, you can create a state, therefore it's physical or geographical features that determine state formation. Of course, there's a big limitation to that argument, because you had one culture that spread out across so much of the Pacific that shared common values and that also shared common social structures. And those structures were lightly hierarchical. They normalized certain light forms of hierarchy in which one family lineage had more status and more influence in a community than other family lineages, and in which men had more privileges in political life than women did. But within those societies, the high status people, like the highest status person possible in that society, would be the oldest male of the most important lineage, still had to work his own fields. He didn't have slaves or servants. He still had to work in the fields like everyone else in order to help feed his family, right? So that kind of gives us a sense of, like if we compare that to the kind of hierarchies in our democratic society, where even just some middling millionaire who made money doing pretty much nothing in the stock market can have who knows how many servants cleaning their house and taking care of their children, and indirectly who knows how many people growing their food, and so forth. When Polynesian peoples got to the Hawaiian Islands, specifically the large island of Hawaii, like elsewhere, they had boats full of domesticated crops, trees, also wild-growing crops that they were more familiar with and that were also food-producing or wood-producing or something else, domesticated animals, and so forth. They basically brought their entire ecology and economy with them, and then planted that across Hawaii, transforming the island, and then spreading out over the island, their population gradually growing over time. And at a certain point, all of the fertile, easy-to-farm lowlands had been populated. I won't say filled up, but in one way or another populated. And in that time, it seems that the hierarchies that they practiced and that they normalized had grown. Somewhat, but not, again, not to the point of anyone having coercive power or anyone being able to force other people to work for them. Let's see, then something happens, which it seems that a certain number of people started leaving the lowlands to farm on the steep hillsides, on the mountainsides. And generally that means having to work harder. It's a more difficult terrain in which to practice farming. And on that material level, it could mean potentially a lower standard of living, right? But a lot of people were choosing to do this. It's very, very possible, especially since it seems that those settlements on the hillsides didn't have these internal hierarchies, that people were choosing a slightly more strenuous, slightly more materially impoverished way of living that also granted them more freedom. And that's another thing that usually doesn't come up among the experts in academy. Western professionals generally hate the concept of freedom, and if you bring it up, in my experience anyways, they usually just try to problematize it away. Well, how can you define freedom? Just kind of play that game and like whittle it away until like you're not talking about it anymore, and you're only talking about things that can be measured and quantified and so forth. But again and again and again throughout human society, we see people taking very great risks even, or rejecting greater material wealth in order to achieve their freedom, in order to live in a way that's more free. And I'm going to talk about this later when I talk about democracy. Freedom is not a universal concept in the sense that it means the same thing to everybody. And particularly in the West, we have what I would consider a very, very corrupted sense of freedom. But even though there's no one definition for it, I think it is something that's constantly there on the human horizon that motivates people to act in certain ways. So you have folks who are living in more material poverty, but also more equality, farming on the mountainsides on the island of Hawaii for a few hundred years, or maybe just 100. Actually, don't quote me on that because I don't have my notes, like I said. But then something happens. Very, very few human societies have figured out how to carry out agriculture on mountaintops. So we definitely can't fault the Polynesians for not being able to, because I mean the United States, we've destroyed the soil on our flatlands, right? So I mean we can't even like farm sustainably on flat river valleys. So after a certain amount of time, because they were cutting down the trees to feed themselves, they experienced erosion, and the fertile soil went downhill, which meant two things. One, they couldn't support their populations there anymore. They couldn't feed themselves on the mountainsides anymore. And two, they basically just refertilized the increasingly hierarchical societies downhill in these more ideal bottomlands. And then they had to go back to those very bottomlands in order to find a place to live. This is speculation, but sometimes it helps as long as we're not claiming that we know that this is how things happened, but to try to get a sense for how things might have happened. If you have people rejecting these high status families, no longer living in a situation where they have to give certain gifts, certain obsequious offerings, and take a more submissive role in certain rituals under these higher status families, and they're living in this more communal, more decentralized way, we can imagine that possibly there was some bad blood there. Possibly there was some outward act of rejection of this other way of living. But now they have to come back, potentially with their tail between their legs, and look for the hospitality of the folks in the bottomlands, who are increasingly controlled by these higher status families. So that's what an authoritarian would understand as an opportunity, right? And what we might look at as a potential conflict. That's actually a situation that we see in a lot of different societies. I personally think that any decent community, when faced with folks who are coming, who know, because of some disaster or catastrophe or crisis, have lost their ability to feed themselves and are coming to you, that you open your doors, you share with them, and you welcome them in. That I think for most of human history has been a pretty common idea, even if nowadays when people cross imaginary lines and have the most minimal expectations, but extremely minimal of hospitality, they're criminalized and subjected to extreme violence, as happens in our society. So another quick example to sort of look at that mechanism, Peter Kropotkin, in his History of the French Revolution, which I highly recommend, looks at a certain conflict that was happening in the countryside in France during this big bloody revolution. So liberal and even more sort of progressive left historians sells the French Revolution as like this great step forward for progress for humanity. and also, I mean, part of one of the factions of the French Revolution, the Jacobins, were also an important model for Lenin, for the Bolsheviks. A lot of people were killing one another in that point in time, but one thing that's not looked at so often is actually a major genocide that took place in the French countryside, where actually hundreds of thousands of French peasants were slaughtered by the revolutionary government, by the Republic. The official history says that these were superstitious peasants who were supporting the Catholic Church and who were supporting the counter-revolution. And there's some truth to that, but it's also a lot more complicated than that. Definitely that's a complication that we should look into, considering that the forces of law and order were loading thousands of peasants onto barges and dumping them into rivers, which is actually also a specific tactic that the Bolsheviks would copy in the Russian Civil War, also against peasants. A lot of these peasants were specifically fighting against the privatization of land. So in these liberal revolutions that happened in France, also in Spain, in other places, this was a central plank of these bourgeois parties. This was a necessary step forward for progress. Destroy feudalism by privatizing land and not communalizing land. Naturally, this meant peasants were losing the last vestiges that they had of their access to their means of survival. The last good things about the Middle Ages, when the state was very weak, was being violently taken away from them. So in addition to whatever sort of manipulative schemes that the Catholic Church was running in order to try to destroy this revolution, there was also a very legitimate cause for concern there among these peasants. So a lot of them were fighting against the privatization of land, to try to hold on to what was left of the commons, right? And Kropotkin noted that in a lot of villages there was a very strong difference between what they called the citizens and the inhabitants, would be the translation. The inhabitants tended to favor the protection of communal lands, whereas the citizens tended to favor the privatization of those lands. And he looked at the origin of this distinction in these rural towns, and found that generally the citizens were said to be the ones who were from that town, and the inhabitants were said to be outsiders who were more recent arrivals. Right? But in a lot of cases, actually, this distinction would go back several generations. So human populations have always had to move around. There's for a very long time there's been warfare. There have always been ecological problems, problems with feeding ourselves. And for a very long time we haven't had borders, so we haven't had impediments to moving around in order to ensure our survival. Going back to this question of hospitality, of different ethos or different community values, what happens when you're living in a place and other people do that most human of things, which is to move there, looking to ensure the continuation of their survival? Do you welcome them in? Do you kick them out, or do you welcome them in and establish certain conditions? So we can imagine a more stingy, less generous society saying, all right, y'all can come in, but we're going to place these limitations, right? We wouldn't be so cruel as to charge y'all rent, because that's something that only a tiny minority of the most bloodthirsty of individuals in human history would ever do, charge money for land. But feudal economies were actually very complex. They had very complex property relations, and there were dozens of different terms for different property relations in terms of whether, like, a piece of land, maybe you can plant wheat there, but then you get to have your herd graze there after the first wheat harvest, and then you get to go there for the gleaning, so after the harvest to pick up what's left of the harvest, and you get to go over the land in order to have access to a well, and you get to plant fruit trees around the border, stuff like that. And all these had very specific terms, and they were specific concrete relationships. So that actually created a whole lot of opportunities for people to say, okay, you can move in here, you can farm this land, but you don't get first gleaning rights, or you don't get forage rights, or you don't have access to this forest for your firewood, for your fuel, or something like that. So they had opportunities to create sort of second-class citizens, or in this case, citizens and inhabitants. And generations later, that would create a very, very meaningful division in that society in terms of how these different, essentially, classes are relating to a very, very important bloody conflict. So we can imagine at least something similar happening when these folks moved down from the highlands in Hawaii to the bottomlands that have recently been refertilized, and which also we can surmise hadn't reached their population max because they were able to take on this new population and continued growing after that. But that point is identified as a sort of acceleration point in the development of more authoritarian political structures moving towards state formation on the island of Hawaii. So we can understand that it's not just this gradual evolution, but this sudden opportunity that local nascent elites have. That they could simply be hospitable and welcome these folks in, or they could use this as the opportunity to create a new lower class in a way that members of the community never would have consented to, never would have abided. And so now with this new lower class, you have more mechanisms for the accumulation of wealth that can be used for also, among other things, supporting more military campaigns. Because the different societies, the different oftentimes federations that existed on the island of Hawaii often engaged in warfare against one another. And so that gave an opportunity for these elites to increase their power, to normalize stronger forms of domination, and or also to avail themselves of more resources and organizational forms. And so really quickly after that, relatively speaking, you get coercive institutions, more systematic warfare, and eventually the political unification of the entire island of Hawaii under one, what at that point can really be referred to as a government. And it's really interesting, there are some theories that a similar thing happened in ancient Egypt on the Nile River Valley, that one year very, very heavy flooding created this huge mobile population that had to relocate, and that the upriver polity had the opportunity to organize as a labor force, using both charity and exploitation, as they often go hand in hand in our society today. So that would be one example of an ecological crisis. And to talk about today, when NATO met in Strasbourg to discuss climate change and responses to climate change, does anyone here? So it's, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, probably the largest military organization in the world, linking together many of the most powerful states in the world, and they had a talk about climate change. Does anyone here know what their proposed responses to climate change were? Militarizing the borders and biometric IDs, right? So, just regular folks at home who don't don't take charge of their own education and just sort of rely on the media to inform them about the world would think that they heard that wrong. That to them would seem like a total non sequitur. What do militarized borders and biometric IDs have to do with climate change? But of course, NATO is taking a very, very pragmatic look at the situation. They know that as they increasingly destroy the global south and the ability of the global south to feed itself, millions and millions more people will have to come to the global north just for reasons of survival. And they are, in true form, preparing a military solution, killing more and more people on the borders and making sure that they can better control potentially marginalized aspects of their domestic populations to have better control over these uprisings that we've been seeing increasingly throughout North America and Europe. So that hasn't changed. They're the ones responsible for destroying the environment, and when things fall apart and people are faced with starvation, not to mention all of the other millions of life forms that are getting annihilated, they see it as an opportunity, which for me really, really drives home why the parts of the climate movement that continue to take states seriously and continue to grant them legitimacy are I think, committing a grave error, because how can you possibly have a solution to a problem in which millions of people have already, not died, been killed, and then not only allow those responsible for that killing to be at the table where you discuss the solution, but you in fact allow them to monopolize any possible discussion of what the solution is. So, just throw that out there. So finally, hopefully I haven't been talking to you all for too long and no one's getting bored yet, but I want to talk about democracy and like the democratic model of the state. Crap, I'm not sure. I think this was 2300 BCE, but again, I lost my notes. So the late Bronze Age collapse, more than 3,000 years ago. So in the Eastern Mediterranean, you had multiple states, like the Mycenaeans, the Hittites, one of the manifestations of the Egyptian state. And these had a lot in common. They were states based on territorial conquest. They were states that had slave economies and based a lot of their activity around capturing populations and forcing people to work. And they were also states that considered rulers divine. They either they were sort of on a continuum from thinking that rulers had privileged access to the gods, or thinking that rulers were gods themselves, or incarnations of gods. And then a few thousand years ago, there was this huge collapse. Pretty much all of the cities in the region, in that regional system of the Eastern Mediterranean, suffered damages or were completely burned down. Many of them never to be rebuilt again, and a number of those states collapsed completely, also never to return, like the Mycenaeans, who were in the peninsulas and archipelagos that we now know as Greece. And so, like different experts, they all have their pet theory about why this happened, right? Some pose that it was because of climatic changes that caused harvests to fail in the Black Sea basin. Others propose because these were economies that were linked together through bronze production, which can't easily be localized. It usually requires exchange and mining of different kinds over a larger region. So some posit scarcity at one point in that productive chain. Others posit invading forces, like the mysterious sea peoples who were talked about in the Egyptian records. None of these theories really seems to be fully satisfying. All of them seem to offer something, but none of them really seem to be able to explain the full picture. So I'm just going to put out there that every time a state collapses, we should at least wonder, we should at least consider the possibility that it was overthrown by its own people and by its neighbors. Like I mentioned, these states systematically went on slave raiding expeditions among their stateless neighbors and enslaved a large part of their own populations. And that's one explanation that a lot of academics are just really loath to consider. That regular people could actually be the protagonists of history, that people would fight back against their own enslavement rather than being liberated. Of course, in official U.S. history, that's sort of the narrative that we've been given, that slavery ended because Abraham Lincoln and the brave Union armies liberated the slaves, totally ignoring lots of insurrections by African people on this continent. So they have this bias towards certain framings of history that makes it less likely for them to consider the possibility of popular rebellions. So this is a hypothesis. We don't have facts to be confident about this, but it is at least useful to explore, especially because it gives us potential explanations for what comes after, which I'm going to get to. But just to sort of play a thought experiment for a moment, let's imagine that all of these uprisings that have been happening over the last few years, and all of these social movements that we're participating in, get stronger and stronger, and eventually succeed in overthrowing states all across the world. But mixed with climate change and all these other more catastrophic situations, all electronic records get destroyed, and many written records get lost, right? All across the world. And then 3,000 years later, whatever class of specialized knowledge producers are asking themselves the question, well, you know, why did this happen? Why did these ancient civilizations fall apart? And one of them will say, well, it was because of climate change, right? Because my samples prove that all throughout the Mediterranean and in large parts of South Asia, where many of the most populous and strongest states were located, there was desertification. There was much less rainfall. But then another specialist will say, yeah, but on the east coast of the North American continent, where it's believed that one empire had its capital, there was actually an increase in rainfall right at the time of this collapse. So that explanation doesn't work. Another one would say, well, in the ancient cities known as Athens and Baltimore and Oakland and St. Louis, we found this archaeological layer of a lot of ashes and burnt artifacts. So we posit that there was some kind of and then we found some old extant economic records in Athens, for example, that spoke of an economic collapse and mass unemployment. So that must be the reason for this collapse. But then someone would say, yes, but we found a similar archaeological layer showing that people burnt their city down in Istanbul and in Rio de Janeiro, right in the same time frame. And we also found economic records showing that those societies were actually in periods of economic growth when that happened. So economic collapse couldn't be the explanation either. And another might say, well, it was warfare. In the country once known as Syria, we found a lot of archaeological evidence of warfare. But then someone would say, well, in this other place we didn't find any of that. And we could just laugh knowing that it was us who overthrew all these states, and that these experts just would never think that just regular people could be the protagonists of history. And what we do see is that there's a sort of Eros effect. There's an effect by which regular people struggling against authority and going up against supposedly much stronger enemies inspire one another across borders. So you actually see the really courageous revolts in the Arab Spring spreading across the Mediterranean on all sides and taking some kind of manifestation in countries that were technically dictatorships and countries that were technically democratic. You see a lot of inspiration between insurrections in countries like Greece that were in total economic collapse and countries like Turkey that were experiencing economic growth. But people basically getting inspired by one another, just like happened in May '68 across the world, and is also happening again. So that's one possibility, but let's imagine what effects that might have, if that's in fact what happened in the Eastern Mediterranean. Because several hundred years after this collapse, large parts of the Mediterranean become stateless again, and in one of them, the place that's now known as Greece, you have a new state appear several hundred years later. But this state was completely different from the one that preceded it. Decisions are made in assemblies instead of a culture of treating authority figures as divine. There's actually a culture of being suspicious, being skeptical, being critical towards authority figures, which is not the same as being critical or skeptical of authority in and of itself. It's a key distinction. They were based more on creating commercial networks rather than creating territorial expansion within a set of borders, and so forth. I definitely won't say that this is the first time that a state like this had ever appeared in the world. Actually, decision making through assemblies is really, really common in human history. But it does seem to be the first time that happened just in this particular corner of the world. When there's a successful rebellion, when regular people are able to defeat a very brutal, oppressive, and seemingly all-powerful enemy, that will almost inevitably lead to cultural changes within the new society that's created. So you have a huge amount of population movement, right? Like I mentioned, like so many of the cities that existed at the time burned down. The people didn't just go away. Those regions remained inhabited, but people were shifting around. societies were being broken apart and recreated. People really had an opportunity to change their forms of social organization and their cultural values. So we can imagine that when they defeated these empires led by men who claimed to be gods and who claimed a right to enslave others, we can imagine them creating societies in which there were generalized ideas that everyone should participate in the organization of their own society. Everyone should participate in decision making. That no one in the society should enslave anyone else, and that they shouldn't try to conquer one another. Other things like that. But what if they didn't go far enough? What if they didn't identify the roots of authority but left some of these intact? For example, like patriarchy. What if they didn't have any models of societies around them that weren't patriarchal, and so they just assumed it to be natural and normal and good? Or what if they did have such models but weren't smart enough, weren't brave enough to recognize these continued oppressive structures that they had in their own societies? So then you still have a very weak, nascent elite in those societies, which would be the elder men, right? And then over hundreds of years, they don't shift society's values 180 degrees, right? They don't bring back the old model of state. They don't convince people to bow down before those who rule them again. They just have to shift society's values, say 45 degrees. They just have to corrupt actually these new ideas of freedom and what freedom means. So, so if freedom attains to individuals, for example, then that creates new possibilities to determine, well, which individuals. If you've already normalized inequality between men and women, then you can talk about freedom as something that applies to men. If you, over time, develop a more closed community after this period of societies shifting around and moving and creating more expansive relationships, you can, over time, change the value that slavery is wrong to a value that simply it's wrong to enslave members of your own community. But you can enslave foreigners, or you can deprive foreigners of full rights. Where once these societies might have had a value that defensive warfare is a good thing, that fighting back against a powerful enemy is a good and a valuable thing, fighting back against an enemy who's trying to enslave you is a good thing, they might over time be able to corrupt that to a value that our community, our society, winning a war against any foreign community is a good thing. So that's not a total shift of values, that's just a corruption of the way freedom is talked about. So this new state, which was oppressive, which was exploitative, which also was based on enslavement, the Athenians subjected many competing societies and city-states to genocide. So they were doing many of the same horrible things that these earlier empires were doing, but if they could just, but nonetheless it was very important to them to talk about freedom. This was an important shared value, and it was also a basis for social cohesion. But what's more, they didn't just make a new state that did some of these earlier bad things, they actually made a stronger state, a state that included some form of institutional memory that was inoculated against the very forms of rebellion that had allowed earlier populations to regain their freedom, right? Because they overthrew their rulers periodically, after every election. Really, they institutionalized that so it became harmless to the underlying authority structures. So in order to overthrow that kind of state, you would need a much more intelligent rebellion. You would need a rebellion with some kind of popular collective memory, understanding themselves on this long timeline, understanding how that way of talking about freedom was actually a corruption and really the assassination of their ancestors' rebellions, of their ancestors' struggles for a more meaningful kind of freedom. White supremacists, which is to say mainstream history, teaches us that Western society descends from ancient Greece. That's total garbage, that's myth. But it's important because things that are imaginary have very real ramifications on the physical world. There's one chapter in the book that deals with imaginary state formation, how state models can be preserved by proto-elites, elites that don't have enough power here and now to constitute a state, but they can preserve state models on an imaginary plane that basically serve as a constant blueprint, allowing them to more quickly recreate some kind of new state. So those imaginaries are very important. Myths are very important. And aside from this mythical continuity that Western states have fabricated with ancient Greece, there are also some very interesting parallels. So, yeah, about like roughly 1,500 years ago, when the Western Roman Empire collapsed, large parts of Western Europe became stateless again. And just really brief to talk about the Western Roman Empire, it was an extremely rapidly patriarchal society based on territorial conquest and based on a very, very violent form of slavery, in which people could be bought and sold with very few rights. Now we're taught that feudalism is awful and that after that you had a Dark Ages. One thing that I think we can very fairly assume is that any time official histories talk about a Dark Ages, we can assume that this was a period of unprecedented freedom, quality of living, and so forth for those peoples who were spoken of as living in darkness. What we know is that for the early Middle Ages, aside from being stateless, large parts of Western Europe either were no longer patriarchal or the patriarchal systems became much, much weaker than what they were under the Roman Empire. That slavery was not allowed, it disappeared. Land ownership, the privatization of land, was also gotten rid of. But some forms of authority and hierarchy persisted, like the Catholic Church, which sort of existed as this pro-state, oftentimes network, really, that maintained this hierarchical statist imaginary. In fact, the first Crusades were fought against stateless populations within Europe, populations that rejected or overthrew state authority in the Pyrenees, in where Berlin is now located, in the Balkans. And in fact, in these early religious wars, heresy, what the Catholic Church would refer to as sexual deviance, and statelessness, or anti-authoritarian social organization, went hand in hand and were indistinguishable. But then over time, you have states being reformed. You have the Catholic Church there, keeping the holiness of authority alive. Okay, all right. So I gotta end soon. And then states are regaining that territory. Eventually, you have the modern state form, which latches onto democracy as its model for organization, also as a way to claim this continuity with ancient Greece and the Roman Republic. And so these states are formed by rulers and philosophers who are talking about freedom. But while they're talking about freedom, they're also engaging in the bloodiest and the largest scale slave trade that had ever existed in human history. They're carrying out total genocide on multiple continents, and they're also reinstituting patriarchy in a very, very strong way. The Renaissance and the Enlightenment, which we're taught were like a re-flourishing of human values and whatnot, were in many ways a very, very violent war against women, against queer people or people who were identified by the leaders of the day as having deviant or non-acceptable sexualities and so forth, people who were gender fluid, and all of that. So I have to wrap up, but we're taught in the official history that now with a more progressive history, like it's acknowledged, like okay, like some of these men, like did these bad things. All right, David Hume and all these other philosophers made their wealth in the slave trade, and okay, Francis Bacon was like actually like a state torturer and stuff like that. No one's perfect. They were products of their time, and I think that that's a very, very damaging, oppressive view of history, because Those two things go hand in hand. The way they talked about freedom is inextricable from their complicity in genocide and in the slave trade, because this was a type of freedom that defined what it meant to be human and granted those who reproduced that type of humanity certain rights, but anyone who rejected that vision of humanity, it subjected them to absolute annihilation and genocide. So their vision of humanity went hand in hand with an acceptance of wage labor, of private property, of government authority, patriarchal relationships, and all these other things that at the time were explicitly coded in white supremacist and patriarchal ways, and nowadays are explicitly coded as being egalitarian and not white supremacist and not patriarchal, even though they're reproducing the exact same values and historical structures. And again, that claim towards freedom that's implicit in the development of this democratic model of state was necessary to get these lower classes on board as the cannon fodder in the revolutions that unseated the nobility and that allowed liberals to impose a private property regime. We can go into that a lot more, but I've been talking too long, and I want there to be time for questions and debate. So I'll just put that out there of an awareness of the history of democracy. For me, problematizes making claims to democracy, as in, this isn't a real democracy, we need a real democracy that responds to our needs, especially since democracy historically has always been a system based on enslavement, exploitation, and so forth. And we see these really, really scary crossovers where first maybe in the Occupy movement over here, or in the Democracia Real Ya, the Real Democracy Now movement in Spain, which was like Occupy, but actually on a much huger scale, claimed we need to fix our democracy, this isn't real democracy, and then that actually gets co-opted very, very smoothly by the right wing, who makes similar claims to democracy and the need to clean up democracy, to make it work for us again, but a very specific us. Or you have very democratic mechanisms like referendums being used in Europe for these far-right political programs, and sadly they actually have a better claim to democracy than we do. So it's an easy way to talk with people, but sometimes the easiest path isn't the best path where radical change is concerned. So I would just like put that out there in terms of, I mean, obviously the history of an idea doesn't at all determine its present or its future use and validity. I'm not trying to make that argument, but at the very least raise this problematic history and think about how the model of government that we have now is institutionally inoculated against many of our rebellions. It's structured to recuperate, to include our rebellions, and destine those rebellions or orient those rebellions to rejuvenating or renewing the legitimacy of the oppressive system itself. And especially since we have elections coming up this year and even bigger ones in 2 years, and in a year in which folks here have achieved amazing things with direct action, shutting down all of the airports in the country and being really the first ones to block, in this case, the Muslim ban, in what I think is on a worldwide scale like an unprecedented tactic, shutting down all the airports of a country. That's amazing, and that really needs to be contrasted with both how it feels and what we actually accomplish when we're receiving all of these changes as spectators to the media, which all of a sudden are the heroes. I mean, they were facing a major crisis, and now they're the heroes because they finally figured out how to do fact-checking. Or these judges who have signed who knows how many deportation orders, but now they're the heroes because they block certain of these really extreme executive orders and so forth. So that that's why I think studying state formation, where states come from, and how they evolve, not as something that happened thousands of years ago, but as a continuous process, seeing as how states always provoke resistance and they're always more fragile than they're letting on, is immediately relevant to us today and will allow us to be more intelligent in our struggles today. So thank you all for listening to that very long spiel. I hope that was useful.